In our ongoing work in the Gospel of Matthew, we find ourselves at verses 15 to 20, uh, chapter 15 and verses 21 to 24. I'm going to be reading from Norley's translation. Matthew chapter 15 and verse 21. Jesus now went away, going back into the districts of Tyre and Sidon. And there was a Canaanite woman from there who came to him and said, "Take pity on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter has a demon and is very miserable." But he did not answer her. His disciples said to him, "Send her away, for she keeps on crying after us." In reply, he said, "I am not sent to anyone but the lost sheep of the house of Israel." Matthew is a gospel that we have noted was written to a Jewish audience. There is the sensitivity to the divine name and not the expression of, so he uses kingdom of heaven, not kingdom of God. It is interesting though, because in Matthew's gospel, there is, in spite of all of this, the fact that he saw the need for the church to reach beyond just the Jewish people. And here's one of these passages that points us to this. Jesus had traveled north and west. He basically went to the very edge of what was Israel, or maybe even beyond. He ends up in the region of Tyre and Sidon. Now, these were coastal cities on the Mediterranean Sea. In their heyday, they were extremely important ports, extremely wealthy cities. Now, to say that he was in the region does not mean he actually got to the coast, but he was right at the edge of what was considered Israel. The assumption that we would make here is that he was an area where the demands of his ministry would be less. So kind of reading between the lines, was he kind of taking a few days off, a little bit of a rest from the weariness of travel and extensive ministry, the demands of the crowds? In that sense, it seems that Jesus was taking a break when a woman shows up, a woman who was not Jewish. The big question in this passage is, how did this woman know of Jesus? She was a Gentile, and we assume that she was not a proselyte. That is, she was not somebody attending a local synagogue as a Gentile. There is no indication in the passage that this event happened on a Sabbath. Now, remember when we talk about Galilee, that in the first century it was not a Jewish center, straightforward. It was a area which had both Jews and Gentiles. Yes, it leaned Jewish, and in the midst of Galilee was the important city of Sepphoris, which seems to probably be more evenly split between Jewish and Gentiles. Population figures in this era, of course, are non-existent, so we have to sometimes make educated guesses. In some ways, this woman had a need and somehow, in some way, heard of what Jesus did, and like many other desperate people, came to him seeking help. Jesus in verse 24 affirms that his mandate was to the people of Israel. In that sense, he is right off the top excluding two groups. He is excluding the Gentiles, such as this woman. Jesus is also excluding those Jews that came to be known as the Hellenists. So if you go to Acts chapter 6, verse 1, you have reference to them. The Hellenists were Jews whose roots were outside Israel. By the first century AD, there was a large Jewish presence outside the Promised Land. And these were people who were not, well, we could say ethnically Israeli, as we would understand it in the first century. These people were descendants of Jewish migrants. Now, not all of the Jewish migrants left because of their own desire and will. Some of these people were probably people who had been enslaved over the centuries, and when they gained their freedom, they just continued in the places that they were. They were people who were comfortable in the larger Gentile world. They were also people whose primary language was Greek and whose Bible or Old Testament was Greek, the translation that has come to be known as the Septuagint. And Jesus also seems in his ministry to spend more time, not only with Jews in the promised land, but in particular, more time in Galilee than Judea. And the difference between Galilee and Judea is simply this: Galilee was ruled under the jurisdiction of Herod Antipas, a client king of the Romans, whereas Judea was under direct Roman rule. In that sense, what I'm getting at is Jesus seems to have kept his focus in terms of his ministry very narrow and very precise. Churches will always reflect communities they are in. Churches, especially if they're not very large, tend not to be very diverse, and I think we can kind of see why that happens. Churches tend to have a sense of who they are and who they are ministering to, and who they are not reaching out to. If a church is not very large, that is probably the best use of resources. Now, the problem is when the church becomes a closed social and ethnic enclave or cultural enclave. In modern terms, what happened in our passage is like when a Hispanic church welcomes a Korean family into their midst, or an upper middle class suburban church welcomes in a homeless military veteran, or an inner city church welcomes in a couple who live in the supervised and secure apartment building that has just been built downtown. The point is not whether we have people that we work best with or identify with in terms of our ministry. It is whether, when the opportunities come and present themselves, we have the flexibility, as Jesus did, to reach out and minister to people where they are at, who they're at, even if they are not what we consider to be our people.